In terms of the main takeaways from the situation in the region, one, just because this conflict is not in the news anymore does not mean that it does not have very serious impacts or that the situation is any less important than it was during active hostilities like we saw in 2019. There is a lower likelihood of a Turkish invasion of northern Syria than there was prior to the earthquake. And when speaking to political and military leaders in the region, they said that this was their assessment. But an invasion does remain a very serious possibility, and people in the region are taking that prospect very seriously. There's been a lot of displacement from frontline and border areas because although there haven't been active Turkish military moves, people are very afraid that in the event of an incursion, they would be in danger. I visited a border village in Kobani where local people told me that about half the residents of that village who had been there prior to October 2019 had already fled, that they live in daily fear of drone strikes and shelling from the Turkish military point that sits on a hill just across from the hill where their village is, and that because parents were so afraid of indiscriminate Turkish attacks, they stopped sending their children to school. So now the autonomous administration actually has to bus those students to a school elsewhere. Services and public institutions in general in these border and frontline areas have been weakened by the dangers caused by conflict. So this is a very serious situation. I spoke with people in border and frontline regions who have chosen to modify their work or even leave political and community organizing positions altogether because they're afraid of being targeted in targeted assassinations and drone strikes that Turkey has been carrying out against SDF and NES leaders and Kurdish civil society. This is another very serious impact. Of course, Turkey's economic and environmental pressure on northeastern Syria, such as the restriction of water flows and the closure of the border for economic activity, have been another driver of poverty, disease, displacement, and other very negative outcomes. And although last year the United States lifted sanctions on northeastern Syria because of overcompliance by most companies, the security situation, and the impact of those broad-based sanctions on Syria that remain, the region actually hasn't seen any benefits because of the remaining international economic pressure. And this is something that everybody that I spoke to, when I asked if they had seen improvements from this move, from this lifting of sanctions, everybody said no. So these are serious problems, both militarily and economically. The situation is unstable, it's difficult. And so although there has not been an incursion and people feel that a new attack like what we saw in Afrin and Sarikaniye is less likely, the situation is still very dangerous. Two, there have been some very important political developments over the past several months, very relevant to the conflict and to the role of the international community. So as some of you may know, following the earthquake in February, the PKK declared a ceasefire on Turkish territory and stated that in other territories where it's active, it will only carry out military actions if it is attacked first. And it was later revealed, including for the first time personally to me in an interview that I conducted while I was in the region with Ozlem Goner, the commander of the SDF, that the international community had been making requests for such a ceasefire to the PKK through the SDF with the goal of that being used to pressure Turkey to take reciprocal steps. This has later been confirmed by other Kurdish sources, but unfortunately what we saw was that when the ceasefire happened, it barely got any media coverage, and we saw no political action from countries involved in Syria, from the main guarantor powers of the 2019 ceasefires, Russia and the United States, from Europe, from any country in the Middle East with an interest in Syria. There was no diplomatic engagement in getting Turkey to reciprocate and, lead to real de-escalation. And so, unfortunately, particularly in Iraq and Syria, where Turkish cross-border military operations are going on, because of the government of Turkey's refusal to acknowledge this, it hasn't had that much of a de-escalatory impact yet. But it is a hugely important development. The ceasefire was recently extended through Turkey's upcoming elections, and it is likely that a new government comes to power in Turkey, the Kurdish movement will give that new government a chance to pursue different policies on the Kurdish issue, to take a turn towards more democratization, more self-determination, more equal rights. And so it's likely that if there's an opposition victory, that ceasefire will be extended. So this is a hugely important diplomatic development, and it's really important for us in the United States, given the role of the US government in so historically, militarily and financially and diplomatically supporting Turkey's efforts to seek a military solution to this conflict. We've seen some rhetoric and statements suggesting that there are different tendencies on this issue now, that peace is more workable and more possible. And this is something that it's going to be very important to encourage, because a political solution to the Kurdish issue is going to be one of the most important developments for the long-term stability of Rojava, of North East Syria, for democratization, and for the rights of all the peoples of Turkey, all the oppressed people there, not just Kurds, but other ethnic and religious minorities, other marginalized segments of society. A peaceful and just solution to this conflict based on principles of democracy and self-determination is something that could be really transformative for the region. And with these really unprecedented steps taken by the Kurdish movement to facilitate this, it's now more important than ever that this issue, be on the political agenda of, essentially anyone and any constituency that can be doing something to make it more public, make it more known, and really get some action going. So I think that, we often feel like, the work that we're doing, maybe we don't have as many people as we see in other countries with more developed solidarity movements. Maybe it's not being as impactful, but we have a chance to have a real impact. I'll tell you guys, when I was in Kandil at Nowruz talking to people there, and when I told them, I was a researcher and I'd come from the United States, everybody's questions were about, what do people in the US think about this conflict? Do they know what their government is doing? We went to a little village called Zergele that in 2015, after Erdogan finally abandoned the peace process, one of the first things that the government of Turkey did was launch these massive bombing raids on civilian villages in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, including this village where nearly 10 people were killed, more were injured. You can still see the destroyed houses. It's really, really sobering to see what an F-16 can do to these little village houses. And the People's Municipality of Kandil has placed in that village near the ruins a museum dedicated to the civilian victims of Turkish and Iranian cross-border strikes in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's the only museum like that of its kind. It's very powerful to see. Of course, in North East Syria, we've talked a bit about the impact of airstrikes and drone strikes in Turkish cross-border operations. So people there are asking, they want to know, Kurds in different parts of Kurdistan, people across North East Syria of all ethnic and religious communities, they know that we, the civil society, the people, any interested constituency here in the countries that support Turkey, and particularly in the US, have a lot we can do to put pressure on our government to change its policies. They believe that we can do it. They want us to do it. And, for the sake of, these millions of civilians impacted by this conflict and the real revolutionary political projects that people across the region are trying to put into practice under these daily threats of poverty, of war, of all of these dangerous, phenomenon that we've talked about related to this conflict, we owe it to them to do as much as we can. So I think that's my takeaway. I'd be really happy to answer everybody's questions, and just to leave it with that note that, the people of these regions, they expect a lot from us. And because of recent diplomatic developments, we're well placed to answer that call, stand up for human rights, stand up for democracy, and put all of these, this solidarity into practice. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. We have time for some questions. So if folks here in the room or on Zoom want to ask anything, please raise your hand. Yeah, Spike? You're muted.
Sorry about that. So you were able to visit Kobani. How are people feeling there, and what's the situation with the Russian security forces and the regime on the border there? If you're able to see
Yeah,
any.
great question. Yeah, so in Kobani, people's perceptions of Russia and of the Syrian government is very similar to their perception of every international actor involved in the Syrian conflict, which is that there has simply not been enough done to enforce the ceasefires in 2019 that were supposed to end the conflict and lead to stability in that region. As you remember, after 2019, there was a Russian-Turkish ceasefire agreement and a US-Turkish ceasefire agreement. And while Kobani is not on any of the front lines, it was very isolated because the Turkish military operation took Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, Sarikanye, which were the two cities next to Kobani. And then since 2016, the Operation Euphrates Shield Zone has bordered Kobani to the other side. So people in Kobani feel that Russia has prioritized its relations with Turkey over upholding the ceasefire, and that Russia is trying to use Turkey against North East Syria in order to force not any kind of real political settlement between North East Syria and the central government in Damascus, but a complete capitulation and a return to the pre-2011 status quo. And this was a sentiment that I saw reflected in all of the areas around the 2019 ceasefire lines, that essentially the government forces are not a very functional deterrent. In the village that we visited, we spoke to some community leaders, and we were standing right in front of a government military point that you could see, and they felt very free and open to say that, look, they come here, they sit here on the border, they're here as part of this agreement, but their presence has done nothing to prevent the shelling of this village, to prevent drone strikes in this village. So we saw that very open criticism. So I think that at the end of the day, what people on the ground in Kobani and in other areas, impacted by conflict are looking for is security and stability. And they just don't feel like any actor involved in northern Syria has been able to take any real diplomatic steps to provide that. And that instead, they seem to be using the prospect of escalation as a diplomatic tool. I think that the most that people have had to say for the 2019 ceasefire agreements is that so far the opposition to a new military incursion by Russia and by the United States has remained consistent, and neither country has given a green light for a new military operation like Russia did in Afrin in 2018 and the US did in Sarikanye in 2019. So that's the view there.
We have Paul next.
Thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure, Meghan, to hear your expertise on these questions and your courage. The question that I had is the perception inside northern Syria, northeast Syria, ANES Rojava, both for the people and for the autonomous administration, how they see, given that we're so close to the Turkish election, first of all, how they see that potentially playing out and how that might affect the situation of what is their perception of what is Turkey's likely position toward Rojava in one event or the other, particularly with the question of the risk of, is there going to be an invasion? I mean, given the earthquake, also how they perceive, did the earthquake reduce the risk of a ground offensive, and also the question of how they perceive the Syrian administration. You answered that in terms of Kobani, in terms of the facts on the ground, but given that we're kind of in this short period between the earthquake and its aftermath and the upcoming Turkish election, what is the likely how they are seeing this play out? What is the perception from inside Rojava, both the administration and for the people?
Yeah, great question. So I would say one, perceptions of the Syrian government. Their publicly stated position currently is and always has been that they would like a political settlement that results in a democratic, multi-ethnic federal Syria within the existing borders of Syria that exists today. They have engaged in negotiations regularly in order to achieve that. And the view of people, very similar to the view of the administration, is that any deal that can be made to prevent more war in Syria and to ensure that there is a future in which the gains of 10 years of the revolution in Rojava in northeastern Syria are protected is important. So they're willing to engage in diplomacy, but they need serious interlocutors. And the view has been that the Syrian government until now has not been serious about making any real political changes, even on matters as simple as linguistic and cultural rights for different ethnic and religious minorities in northern Syria, basic demands that the autonomous administration has. So that unwillingness to come to a settlement that recognized sort of key central demands of the autonomous administration has been one of the sticking points in negotiations. And right now the view is that the door is always open for a political solution, but it doesn't look possible, particularly with some of what Turkey has been trying to do and the prospect of Turkey and the Syrian government working together to try to crush the project altogether. In terms of perceptions of Turkey and the elections in Turkey, we have a very similar situation. They are open to dialogue with anyone, but that dialogue has to be serious. The belief right now is that there is no prospect for any kind of sustainable improvements to the status quo if Erdogan wins. They have attempted to negotiate with Erdogan's government before, but we've seen how that's ended. We saw that in 2019, the SDF held up their end of the deal on the safe zone and Turkey broke their end of the deal. We've seen that they've repeatedly said that they don't want to pose a threat to Turkey, that they want to find a political solution with Turkey, that they're willing to help Turkey resolve its broader Kurdish issue. And time again, we've seen the Turkish government under Erdogan purely choose military aggression and state its attempt to its interest in eradicating the AANES and SDF altogether. The perception is that a new government is unlikely to be worse, while there are varying degrees of perceptions on how much better it could be. I think that most people there believe that if the new government comes to power with the support of the HDP and the pro-Kurdish political movement in Turkey and Kurdish voters, that a big priority for the HDP and for its constituency will be that a new government does not continue military attacks against North East Syria and that it pursues a peaceful solution to the Kurdish issue at the negotiating table based on the platforms and proposals for a solution that the Kurdish movement has put into practice before and worked with in negotiations before. Now, the opposition alliance, and Ozlem will talk more about this, contains a sort of wide spectrum of views from people who are just as nationalist and hostile to Kurdish demands as the current government is, to people and entities that have taken more de-escalatory positions. For example, last year, or it might be 2 years ago now, the CHP voted against the authorizations of military force for Turkey's cross-border operations in Iraq and Syria. They've stated that they want to improve their relations with Turkey's allies, and certainly, repeated threats against Northeast Syria have been one of the causes of the sort of rift in Turkey's relations with some of the countries that it's traditionally allied with. And, the role of the HDP in any new government and any new parliament could mean that an opposition victory could lead to a better policy. So people see hope for that. And the door will be open to negotiate with any new Turkish government. Notably, this is something that the Kurdish movement feels very strongly about, is protecting Northeast Syria both prior to the elections and after the elections. And my assessment is that one of the reasons why the ceasefire was called, of course, to protect the humanitarian response after the earthquake, that was the main reason why it was done. But it was likely also related to the fact that it helps take away some of the political pressure on Northeast Syria and makes it easier for the international community to enforce the ceasefires and prevent a Turkish incursion, and opens the door to negotiations that could, not only protect Northeast Syria, but resolve the Kurdish issue more broadly in the event of an opposition victory. It also takes away some of the possibilities for Erdogan to use an incident like the bombing in Istanbul in November as a pretext for conflict prior to the elections. And as is clear to everybody, you know, if the elections are held in an environment where there's more conflict, it's less likely that they will be as fair as they could be or as free as they could be. And we know that Erdogan has used violence to shore up his position around critical elections before. So I think those are some of the developments related to that. That's how people see a lot of these things over there. If that answers your question, you asked also, did the earthquake impact the chances of an incursion? What all the SDF people I talked to told me is that they now see it as much less likely than it was before. Maybe you'll remember prior to the earthquake, they were saying that they expected an attack in February. Obviously, that did not happen. So it's definitely less likely than it was, but it can't be ruled out.
I think we have a time
Maybe-
for.
Okay, Debbie is next for the Q&A on the virtual room. I'm not sure if you have there anyone, Anya.
Yeah, Debbie can go.
Thanks, Megan, thanks for such this great presentation. I was really interested in your comment that the PKK ceasefire was essentially initiated by the international coalition or at the request of the international coalition. And yet you said, you know, it somehow didn't result in an opening for any further action by the coalition to pressure Turkey. And you know, and then given what you also said in response to another question about Turkey sort of putting pressure on the ANES in order to make it capitulate to Damascus, which surely can't be in the US interest. I was wondering kind of what is it that the international coalition expected to see? More media coverage of this? I mean, how can they say, on the one hand, go ahead and initiate a ceasefire so we can start to put pressure on Turkey, and then suddenly say, well, there's just hasn't been much interest in this, so we're not going to put pressure on Turkey. I was just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on exactly what went on there.
So based on my understanding,
I'm sorry
Sorry?
to interrupt. I know you don't have much time. I know Flint also has a question. I was wondering if you would like to get these two and then address them together to end. Is that
yeah,
does
that'd be
that work
perfect.
for you? Okay. Flint, please go ahead.
Hi, Megan. So outside of the obvious differences in relation to the economy and the ongoing airstrikes, military operations by Turkey and its proxies, what is your impression of actually the differences between Rojava and Bashar, or you know, Erbil, Soleimania, and Kandil?
We could do an entire other event on that question. I think that having seen both Suleimania and particularly Erbil, and then seeing Rojava, Northeast Syria, you know, obviously is in a much more difficult situation because of the war, as you mentioned. But if you look at what the government in Iraqi Kurdistan has done with its relative stability and its relative wealth when compared to Kurdish regions in Syria, in Turkey, and Iraq, you see that unfortunately, they have chosen to make decisions in which the benefits of their autonomy have gone to the very few at the top. And you see a lot of the average people in very difficult situations economically and lacking real options for change politically. Now, Kandil is very interesting. Kandil has a self-organized people's municipality that makes up the 63 villages that are there. A lot of civilians do live there. And like you see in Northeast Syria, particularly in places like Kobani, places where there were these big battles against ISIS, there's an incredible sense of pride in the people's resistance and their resilience to years of attacks. Kandil notably has not only been attacked by Turkey, it's been attacked by Iran as well. And of course, back when Saddam Hussein was still in power, it was, you know, attacked by the Iraqi regime. It's been a base of Kurdish resistance to the nation states in Kurdistan since well before the PKK was there and before the PKK's uprising began. Kurdish Peshmerga fighting the Islamic Republic and the Shah of Iran before that, and Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq fighting Saddam Hussein's regime have also been based in that area because of the geography and the location. It's very strategic. And you really get that sense from the people, the same that you get in North East Syria as well, that they're willing to defend their identity and defend their achievements. You know, speaking with the people there at Nowruz, you know, every year they welcome guests from, you know, all across Kurdistan. The first people I actually talked to were an older couple from Diyarbakir originally, who are now living in a major city, a Turkish city, who had driven all the way down to Iraqi Kurdistan just to come to Kandil for Nowruz. We met a family from Rojava, from the Iranian Kurdish region, that had actually fled to Kandil seeking refuge because they were politically active in Iran and were being persecuted by the government. And they chose that the villages of Kandil were where they wanted to go. They participated in the self-organized system there. So it's really, you know, it's a view of, in a different context, you know, that's still very impacted by war, this democratic confederalist grassroots system and that principle of self-determination really being taken up by the people. So I think that overall, while people in these conflict impacted areas have been through a great deal, we can't minimize the seriousness of the situation. They have a resilience and a belief in their project. And I think that they can look to the example of the KRG to learn that when they gain their autonomy, that when these political projects succeed, that they don't want to make some of the mistakes that have led to a status quo in the KRG where, you know, a few elite have benefited much more from that autonomy than the rest. So those are some of those differences. Those are some of my observations there. In terms of Debbie's question, just based on what was alleged to me and the reporting that I've done, I am of the view that if the United States or European countries or any other countries are involved in pushing for this, and we know it has been alleged that the United States is, why we haven't seen more public action, particularly the sort of action that perhaps the Kurdish side would have wanted, would be that there's a view that any kind of public action on these issues prior to the elections could backfire. We know that Erdogan tends to benefit from international crises with really any country that Turkey has relationships with, and particularly as he's trying to set up Turkey as a regional power, you know, as not dependent on any outside actors in the election, and show that he's the only person who can stand up for Turkey as a major power in the region. I think that a lot of countries don't want to hand him a diplomatic crisis, particularly one that he could use to escalate threats against North East Syria. I do also think that, as with any policy, you know, this is something where policymakers believe that they can get away with maintaining a very dangerous status quo simply because they're not hearing interest from elected officials, from the media, from civil society groups and interest groups and communities. You know, as with any political issue, not only in international relations, but anywhere, if there's no pressure, if there's no attention, if people don't know what's going on, it's much easier for policymakers to get away with what they're doing. For example, I think we all know that the US recently approved the sale of modernization kits for Turkey's F-16s. You know, there's been a huge campaign against the sale of the jets, and I'm certain all of the people and organizations, you know, who've been doing great work on that are going to keep working on the issue of these modernization kits as well. But it's the sort of thing where, you know, they think no one's paying attention, so they take a small step that is, you know, not what we would like to see and not what a lot of different constituencies would like to see. So I think public pressure matters. I think that it'll be limited to see what can happen before the elections. And I think that part of what's going on as well is that the chances of any kind of new peace process succeeding are much higher under a new government than they are under a continued Erdogan government. So you might see countries that might be wanting to engage in this not only feeling as though it's a low priority, but also attempting to run out the clock on Erdogan because negotiating this with Erdogan's government while, is not something that, based on everything I've heard and what you hear in a lot of the public messaging from the Kurdish side, people don't believe that he will ever be sincere about a deal, given what has happened over the past several years. And, to be fair, also, there's a lot of doubt about the sincerity of, this growing alleged international diplomatic engagement in this issue. And I think that's where we come in. We don't know how serious or sincere this is yet, but we have the power to raise awareness and, put pressure and make it as sincere as we possibly can. So that would be my answer to that. And yeah, I do have to go soon. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope that this was helpful.
Thank you so much, Meghan.
Thank you so much, Meghan, for sure. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, guys.
Okay, take care. Hope to see you, talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Now we have Ozlem, who is a member of Emergency Committee for Rojava, for those of you who don't know her, and a professor here at CUNY Graduate Center and College of Staten Island as well. And Ozlem will talk a little bit more about the elections in particular and what that means for Rojava and the Kurdish population beyond.
Okay, hello everyone, nice to see you all. So yes, the Turkish elections, the big date, May 14, everyone is waiting for it at the moment. Because obviously Turkey, many of you know, has the AKP government has turned into a fascist dictatorship that's constantly opening war against Kurds in the past decade. And the opposition now is, as Meghan said, is composed of 6 different political parties, which is a very mixed group of parties, and including the major party is the Republican People's Party that's leading, and the Kılıçdaroğlu, who's actually from the region of Dersim, which is a Kurdish and Alevi, so it's a religious and ethnic minority town, though he doesn't openly claim that identity. Though he's, leading the opposition, he's the candidate, he's the presidential candidate. But in the group, in the oppositional coalition, there's also the second major party would be the ultra-nationalist İYİ Party, the Good Party, with the leader Meral Akşener. Now that makes things very tough. And then there's a handful of smaller parties, some of them, previously AKP members, liberal, pro-market allies, and one Islamic party is included in the opposition bloc. Now, people have recently, were very happy about a recent speech that Kılıçdaroğlu gave the opposition candidate, presidential candidate, where he said that, criticized the AKP government for treating all Kurds as terrorists. And he said that because, basically what the media, which is basically Turkish media, has now been ruled by the AKP government for some time now, and they're trying to associate the opposition with terrorism. They're trying to obviously associate HDP with opposition, and even though the opposition coalition did not reach out to HDP because the ultra-nationalist Good Party said they would veto it and they would be out of the coalition if HDP, if the, Kılıçdaroğlu's party asked for HDP to participate in the coalition, which was very disappointing, obviously, for those of us, let me say, who had any hopes about the oppositional bloc. And so, I mean, it is, as Meghan said, this is really what it is. That's Kurds, HDP, everyone who's opposing or who's hurt by the current fascist government of Erdogan says that it cannot be any worse. And that's true. That's the reason why people are excited. But there are also legitimate reasons as to not to make that hope grow too much. And there are also both in terms of the constitution of the coalition, their ideology and their political practices, and also in terms of whether the AKP would allow for such a transition, given the power that it had accumulated in all branches of the government and in military, in police forces, that whether there can be such a transition, even if the opposition coalition actually, whether there can be fair elections. So there are many questions as to both what these elections can mean and whether there is a chance that the opposition might win. And then there's the question of if the opposition wins, what does that say for Kurds and what does that say for more broadly democratization of Turkey? So those are like a set of questions that people ask and answer. So, there is serious concerns that AKP will do everything that they can to stay in power. And that includes, obviously, unfair elections, that includes preventing people from going to election sites, counting of the votes, so everything. And also recently, the AKP government called all, military and police to be on site during the elections and afterwards, which was very concerning. And unfortunately, the coalition bloc is not, opposition coalition is not ready for these kinds of, and they're not preparing. It's not just they're not ready, but they're not really preparing for election fraud and more. And so there's a question there. Then the second question is, what is the coalition? What is it really promising? So Meghan is right, 2 years ago that they finally vetoed another military operation into northern Syria. But then we know that they gave green light to the initial operation. And we know that every time the government starts, the AKP government starts an incursion into the region, they side with the government because they're very afraid to be named as, terrorists. And this is the first time. That's why it's a welcome stance for Kılıçdaroğlu to say something as vague as not all Kurds are terrorists. So basically it's not nearly recognize, it's very far from recognizing, right, like self-determination of Kurds. It's very far from any type of peace signaling with the PKK. It's very far from even sitting on the table with HDP, forget about the PKK. And we know that during the peace process, which the AKP government started, the main opposition to the peace process was actually the Republican People's Party, the CHP, CHP. They were very oppositional. A huge part of this party is also composed of nationalists who are denialists when it comes to the Atatürk and secular republics, war crimes, crimes of massacres and genocides against the Kurdish people. So they're not close to recognizing these, historical massacres and violence against Kurds. They have not signaled any of that yet. But again, I personally am trying to be hopeful as someone who can't enter Turkey under the current government, that everybody, friends and HDP that are on exile have some hope that there will be some level of opening, though it is the terms of it and whether or not this can be, this is hard for this coalition to be the initiator of peace, especially given the big role the Good Party, the ultranationalist party, openly racist ultranationalist party, let me put it that way, and their stance on the Kurdish issue, given Good Party is an important component of this coalition, that the likelihood of a peace process initiated by such a government, let's say that, everything goes well and they actually gain power, is still quite questionable. So those are some of the developments in terms of the coalition front. And I would say the HDP itself, there were some some recent controversies about some of the candidates that HDP, showed. And some of the, journalists like Cengiz Çandar, that was one of the candidates, has been known to call PKK terrorist, Öcalan a terrorist. And so there's some developments that weren't very welcome among the more leftist progressive elements of the HDP. So, and also there was a little bit of controversy as to the lack of Ezidi candidates during this elections. I think the candidate is running on the 12th place in Ahmed Diyarbakir. And so there were some critiques among the selection of the candidates in the HDP. But still, I mean, they've obviously done many organizers from the ground are also running as candidates, and 40% women quota. As usual, they went higher than that in the election of the candidates, and putting the women candidates in high priority places. Those kinds of democratic mechanisms they have applied. Just at this moment, people are expecting more from the HDP. So that's why what some of the critique is around, I should say. And I think there are other people here, if, Halil, Emre, if Yeter, if anyone wants to add something, please go ahead, I would suggest. Or others who have been following closely.
Or if people have any questions, we can.
Yeah, we can do Q&A. I was just wondering if,
David here.
Yeah.
David here has a question.
Yeah. Hi there. I've heard a couple of times you and Megan were saying if the opposition can't be any worse. And while that's good, I keep hearing it qualified as to how much better it could possibly be. And what I'm hearing is not a whole heck of a lot, except to be more democratic. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, yeah, because the AKP government to stay in power had to really, really go on to the Kurdish populations, use the discourse of terrorism, start war. I mean, make, something like bomb its own population so that they can attack northern Syria. I mean, so that they can attack Rojava. It's really recently, especially the bombing of like its own civilians, it's become like, it's very clearly that Turkey like coordinated this just to start a war. And that if it wasn't the earthquakes, it could have done that, so to distract the populations away from the economic crises. But the reason it's not hopeful is that, I mean, economic crisis is because of the neoliberal policies that were set in place, as we know, in majority of the Middle Eastern world. I mean, the Arab revolts were basically a response to the inequality imposed by the neoliberal policies, which the new government is not especially, like, they're not promising social democracy, they're just promising market economy, again, that's more fair, that's like not just around the government's capitalism. I mean, it's still basically capitalist market economy. So to what extent they can even promise a non-crisis economy is very questionable. In that sense, you're right, David, that we can only say that it can't be worse. Hopefully it won't be worse. Although the peace process, I'm not very hopeful about at all for such a coalition to start.
We have Flint with a question or comment.
Sure, probably both. So while things hopefully won't get worse, they could certainly get worse even in the event of a CHP victory, in that Erdogan and also MHP may wish to contest even an opposition victory. It was only a few years ago that in which Turkey's F-16s were bombing their own parliament. And regardless of whether you think the coup by Gulenus was real or fake, while those events were going on, the army did what the majority of people in Turkey did, and that is sit on their hands and do nothing, leaving the fighting to go on between a handful of military and police who were loyal to Erdogan. So there is a greater than 0% chance that Erdogan does not choose to leave power voluntarily, but causes just enough confusion to try and settle things in a military manner. And then we would have to see what happens. I want to know if Ozlem has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that's why I am saying that there's no preparation as to like what happens if Erdogan does not leave power, which is very likely. I mean, we've seen that even like in the US and in Turkey with like a history of military coup d'etats in this country. And it's very likely. And that he will not go in peace. And that's why I said that this is very concerning that they're calling all the police and this is like, you know, this is the documentation that made it to the public and what they're discussing internally, and to see that the opposition doesn't start to make this an issue and doesn't prepare and doesn't give, you know, any signals of the unacceptability of this. And also like, it's been, you know, whenever there's a military threat by Erdogan, the opposition always like prevents people from going on the streets. It's like they criticize anyone who's like calling for a people's movement. So that's also very concerning. Like there's no preparation for such scenarios, which I agree with you, Flint, that are very likely. So I think that's a very that's a very legitimate concern and a very legitimate critique, I would say, of the coalition, the oppositional bloc.
Anything else? Questions, comments before we move on with our agenda? Okay, Paul.
Thank you so much. So the question that I have, and Ozlem, thank you for mentioning these three components, which are, you know, what are the stakes of the election, what is the likelihood of the electoral result, and, you know, what is there going to be a January 6th type of a scenario. So I think on the first question of the actual election and its result, the million lira question might be the turnout and the participation, and linked to that is this question about the ambivalence that you mentioned. And so the calculus in Bakur, you know, in among Kurdish populations, among women of all ethnicities throughout Turkey, among people of the Democratic Confederalist persuasion, you know, are they going to turn out? You know, given that a lot of them feel, well, this is not going to be much of a difference, or that yes, this is a nation state enemy, but you still have to engage in it. And one of the ways of engaging it is to try to push Erdogan out. So how do you think people are processing this in terms of their decision of whether to vote and whom to vote for? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the voting rates have always been very high in Turkey. People have like really feel stakes and go out to vote. The only, and I mean, at the moment, especially, people are organizing both in Turkey, even in diaspora. Like there's a lot of organizing, especially I would say among the, you know, oppositional, like, I mean, the People's Republican Party. The one problem was especially in the earthquake regions, because these people were displaced, and the majority of those regions are Kurdish or Alevi. I mean, these like Hatay, Antakya, which is, you know, historically an Alevite town that's been very much against the government. And that's, you know, as we discussed this previously, that those were the reasons why people were critical of the government not responding, because some of these were oppositional, major oppositional towns. So there is concerns about the displaced people and whether the procedures followed to enable them to vote in the places that they moved to. I think that's not clear, but that there's a chance that the government will play, like it'll play with those votes. But for the rest of the country, the participation rate will be high, will be very high actually, because it's like so much, it's divided into like two quite oppositional camps, and everybody feels high stakes and feels safe enough to go and vote. What is unsafe is what will happen to the votes, whether or not they'll be stolen. And so there'll also be people will be like staying awake in the election sites, really doing what they're there to do for nights if necessary. Like I'm aware we're getting, news about the counting, people will really do it. Yeah, but again, at what level fraud will come in is a different question, but the participation will be high. People will participate, except the earthquake regions, which is shaky.
Thank you.